Chorus Voices, the podcast brought to you by Chorus, a fresh approach to community service. Settle in, listen in, and enjoy the voices who bring you reflections, musings, and stories from our community.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Chorus Voices. I'm CEO Dan Minchin.
And I'm Head of Brand and People, Lou Forster.
And today we have something a little bit different for a Chorus Voices podcast. We have a guest in the studio.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Jason Burton. I'm Head of Dementia Practice and Innovation at Alzheimer's WA.
It's great to have you in the studio, Jason, and I really appreciate you reaching out in September in Dementia Awareness Month and saying, I've been listening to your podcast and I'd really love to come in and have a conversation. So it's great to have you in the studio.
Thanks. It's my pleasure. I know dementia will affect many staff and clients of Chorus, and I think it's a key issue for our community. So any opportunity to talk about it, I think, is an important one.
Yeah, and it really is something that is sort of grown as a challenge that we face as a society. Along with that growth has been change in the way we sort of we manage it, and we might talk about a few of those things. We've also got, as we normally do with the Chorus Voices podcast, is a conversation with some people from within the Chorus community living with dementia. But maybe you could start, Jason, just by giving us the basics. What is dementia? What do we know about it? How does it develop, and where do we see it most?
Sure. When people often get confused by the term dementia and how it relates to Alzheimer's disease in particular, I think the way we describe it is dementia is very much an umbrella term that covers a whole range of neurological conditions, over 100 different conditions that affect the brain. The most common of those conditions is Alzheimer's disease, and so that's why you hear a lot about Alzheimer's disease more so than any of the other dementias. But fundamentally, when we're talking about dementia, we're talking about a broad range of conditions. We've known about dementia for over a century, so this isn't anything new. I think in the last 20 years, it's really risen to prominence in community thinking and health and government thinking because of the increasing prevalence rates. There's good news and bad news in the statistics. The good news is the incidence rates are actually down. So incidence is, if you look at a population of 100 people, how many people out of that 100 will develop dementia? Now, when we started to do the forecasting probably 25, 30 years ago, we were expecting there would be more people with dementia now than there actually is. Why are we seeing incidence rates lower than we thought they would be? We think that that's because there's actually a lot of modifiable risk factors that we can address in our lives that will reduce the risk of you getting dementia. And as we've seen this cohort of population come through that are now at the at-risk population, we've seen that things like diet, lifestyle, exercise, giving up smoking, reducing alcohol intake, all of those things are key risk factors in developing dementia. So whilst prevalence is the overall number of people, whilst prevalence is still going up dramatically, and that's predominantly because we are an ageing population and we have this group of people who have come through together from the baby boom generation. Once you get into the 70, 75 plus range, that's your highest risk area of developing dementia. And because people are living longer and we've got this big, large population, we're seeing the prevalence of dementia increase dramatically, but the good news is the incidence is actually lower than we thought it would be.
And it's interesting to hear that people are getting good at managing those risk factors because, as far as I understand it, we don't really know a lot about what causes dementia and the sort of the mechanical process behind it.
Again, depends on the types of dementia. Some dementias we know more about than others. Certainly if we look at the biggest one, Alzheimer's disease, we still don't really know what's triggering that in the brain. What is it that's causing these disruptions in the neurons and the things like the amyloid buildup and the tau buildup that's creating the damage in the brain. What we are seeing increased statistics and research around is that these things that you do earlier in your life will have an impact on the resilience of the brain later in life. The research that's coming out now is really starting to show pathology change in the brain probably in your 40s and 50s before symptomology starts in your 70s. So in terms of a risk reduction strategy and health and lifestyle change, it's in that 40 and 50 age group that we really need to be doing more.
So that's certainly one for me to think about, Jason, entering that age bracket. And I'm also thinking about how it impacts on how we live our life. So if you're someone perhaps living with dementia or a family member has, what sort of impacts does it have on your life and every day?
I think the important thing to think about is that dementia is a journey. And so at the day of diagnosis, your life probably hasn't changed anything from the day before in reality in terms of your functioning.
And even that journey to diagnosis takes a long time, doesn't it?
It does. It takes on average 2 to 3 years for most people. If you're a person under 65 with dementia, it takes 4 to 5 years because they're not looking for dementia. So when the first symptoms start, and the first symptoms, again, depending on the type of dementia, but usually are around that cognitive functioning, particularly in short-term memory loss, particularly in word finding, and sometimes in task management, so actually being not able to flow through a number of complex tasks to get to an endpoint. Those are the first things that we see get affected. It's very difficult to diagnose dementia or Alzheimer's disease or any of the dementias at the moment because we don't have a clinically sound diagnostic tool, blood test or anything like that at this point in time.
It's more a sort of a set of criteria and balance of probabilities and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is if you are worried about your memory or somebody's memory, go and see your doctor. We know people delay going to see the doctor. We all do it for whatever reason. But there are lots of things that can cause cognitive problems that actually can be cured. So it's really important that we go get tested and make sure it's not something that can actually be fixed or that there's medication for that will help.
And does that delay relate to stigma associated with dementia, or is it I'm frightened of what I might hear, or
I was thinking fear.
all of the above?
Yeah, I think all of the above. I think as human beings we tend to put off till tomorrow what we should be doing today. That's
Put our head in the sand.
It's a human trait. I think stigma is certainly a really key issue. People, I hear, from the research and the social research that's been done, that dementia is now more feared than cancer from a diagnostic point of view of actually being diagnosed it. Because at least with cancer, there is now hope for treatment and for cure.
And heaps of understanding, right?
Yeah,
As you said,
known and
dementia
unknown.
remains very unknown.
It's very unknown, and stigma, shows time and again in the research that stigma is one of the number one issues that people living with dementia face. And that can be internal or external,
Right.
in that we internalise it and we feel that we won't talk to people about it, or we won't seek help, or we won't go find out what's going on because of the stigma we have in ourselves, or externally how people actually respond to us when they find out that you've got memory difficulties or you've been diagnosed with dementia.
And Lou, you've been out into the Chorus family and had a chat with with the family living with dementia, I guess, and you sort of picked up on some of the themes that Jason's talking about.
Yeah, particularly you saying about internalising the stigma, Jason. I was reflecting on, I guess, the stages through dementia, and from what I understand, in the early stages, people can be quite aware that they have either memory issues or some of the problems, or even the awareness that they've got dementia themselves. And I went out and spoke to a lovely lady called Blanche, who's a friend or an MBA friend of mine, Sarah's mum. And so she's at the moment not acknowledging that she has dementia. Likewise, we have someone called Andy who's worked with Chorus for a long time and is featured on a couple of podcasts, and he's got early onset dementia, and you know him, Jason. He is aware that he has dementia, and that's really challenging. So that internalised concept of self seems just really challenging to deal with.
It is. The brain's a very complex thing. It's a complex thing for two reasons. One, because of its complexity of how it's actually formed and what it does. But it's also very much influenced by us as individuals. And that's what makes it probably the most complex organ of the brain by far. And that's what makes dementia the most complex condition we will ever face, because the three of us sitting around the table here could all get a diagnosis of the same type of dementia tomorrow. Clinically, we may follow a similar pathway. It will be slightly different, but it will be similar. How we respond to it as people will be totally different in my experience. I've met thousands of people living with dementia, and they all have responded to it differently because they're all individuals. So there's a real complexity.
Let's start hearing from some people who've got some life experiences in this space.
Hi, I'm Sarah Newbold and I'm a Perth born and bred. I'm an only child of Alan and Blanche. I guess I'm talking to you today because both my grandmothers had dementia and now my mum has advanced dementia. I started out my career as a social worker, and I started it out because of an experience I had in a dementia unit when I was 15 at high school. I was on community service and as part of a school program, and realised I really enjoyed working with people and in challenging environments, and went on to study social work. and never could have foreseen that, dementia would become such a big part of my life and has brought me to where I am today as an aged care social worker. This high school I went to had a community service program that we had to do in year 10, and we all had to go to different sort of charitable organisations and spend an afternoon there, and it was really to, increase and enhance our learning of community. I was placed in a dementia ward with 2 friends, and the 2 friends of mine didn't enjoy the experience so much. I really did. It felt very natural to me, just to interact with people and in a slightly different circumstance. And it was that experience that Mum and I spoke about when I was doing my Year 12 studies and trying to figure out what to study at university, that helped me determine that social work was the path that I was going to take. So that was important. But then it turns out my paternal grandmother went to the same ward 2 years later, and now my mum also resides there almost 20 years later.
He likes music. I like music a lot. I hear that you don't mind a bit of music as well, Blanche.
Oh no, I like the music.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Who's your favourite?
My favourite?
Cliff Richard! Yay!
What's your favourite Cliff Richard song?
Oh, I don't know.
I can't even think
I
what
like
he
them
sings.
all that he sang.
Devil Woman.
Oh yeah,
That's a good
Devil
one.
Woman.
Actually, that's a good one. I don't mind that one.
We listen to them in the car, don't we? When we drive to the shops, we always put it on
yeah.
Spotify.
Yeah.
We have Cliff Richard, Elvis, Doris Day on rotate.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Jason, you said earlier that the way we as a society respond to people living with dementia needs to change, and in many ways is changing, and it's not so much a sort of clinical question, is it?
No, it's not. It's a social issue. And I think that's the biggest shift I've seen. I'm a mental health nurse by background and trained 30 years ago. And dementia was very much in a medical framework. Our understanding of dementia, the very poor management and treatment of people living with dementia, it was very much set within a medical model understanding of what was going on with the brain and really didn't look at the person. I think the biggest evolution I've seen in my 30 years would be in a shift into a societal and community view of dementia.
And it seems to me, and I could be not quite right with this, but some of the really harrowing stories we hear out of the Royal Commission into Aged Care is of stories of people being very poorly supported living with dementia, and then there's sort of the escalation of so-called behaviours and this sort of thing that in your professional background, you can probably almost picture how that comes to pass and how 180 degrees from the best way to respond that sort of story is.
Absolutely, Dan. I think for me, if I've learned anything on this journey from people living with dementia, and I'm very privileged to have learned a lot from people living with this condition, it's that there is no us and them. And I think when we see the breakdown in services and we see the neglect and abuse of people living with dementia, and we see, when we look at stigma really, it comes from a position of us and them. You with dementia are different to me without dementia at a fundamental level. And I think once you start to do that, and it's not just people with dementia, it's homeless people, it's people with mental health conditions, really, any marginalised group, once you start to do that, it then becomes okay to treat them differently. And I think when I...
Sort of dehumanise.
It's dehumanising and objectifying. And so I wouldn't want me to be treated like that, but that's okay because I'm not you, because you've got dementia and I haven't. So I think until we really get to the crux of understanding that this is a human condition that affects human beings and doesn't fundamentally change the human being, then we won't stop the neglect and abuse that we're hearing horror stories about in the Royal Commission. We won't change the stigma. We have to really, as a community, as an individual, challenge ourselves to honestly and deeply believe that fundamentally all human beings are the same and we all need fundamentally the same things.
And at the other end of the spectrum, at the optimistic end of the spectrum, some of the things that we hear and read about really progressive responses to people living with dementia and their families are really quite extraordinary, aren't they? Can you share some of those really real high points.
Yeah, Dan, we look at a model called the domains of well-being, and these 7 domains are really fundamental human needs. And so when we see services or we see response to people living with dementia that focus on these areas, and by these areas I'm talking about things like a sense of identity, who I am, that need for that sense of identity won't change if you get dementia. Meaning and purpose. You mentioned Andy earlier. One of the great things I learned from Andy was how important meaning and purpose is in life when you have a dementia diagnosis, and the opportunities that you was able to give Andy to volunteer and be part of something meaningful to him made a massive difference to his dementia journey. It really did. Joy. You've talked about joy in meeting the lady in residential care. We need joy in our lives. It doesn't matter if you've got dementia or not. So there's all of these fundamental human needs that we have. And when we set up our services to really focus in on them, not to focus on the deficit, which is what we tend to do, or the management of behaviour, which we tend to do, but actually looking at the human needs and how we develop and grow well-being with a person, then we will see a very different outcome in the way we do services and the way that services are received, and then the outcomes that services can have.
We try and go to a different park or a different lake every week.
Yeah.
Went to one in, where did we go last time? Oh, Hyde Park. We went and saw guide dogs.
That's right.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so we were sitting there watching and they were training all the guide dogs, and a guy came up to us with one and said, "Oh, would you like to pat it?" I said, "No, we're not allowed to." He said, no, this one's retired. It's an ambassador.
Okay.
And they bring it along as a distraction dog if they need it in their training program. And he said, "I was watching you both and you both seemed really interested in what was going on," because we were sitting there with our coffees watching. And we got to pat Evie, the ambassador dog, which was gorgeous.
What was his name?
Evie.
Oh, Evie.
Yeah, she was a black Labrador.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, I'll show you, Mum. I got a photo of it.
Oh, you got a
just to
photograph?
remind you. Yeah.
Oh, it was a lovely.
I have to get them printed out, and that because Mum is a big animal lover. So that's Flossie, the support dog that comes here and visits. So we got some photos and printed them out.
Nice.
Yeah.
Lovely dog. I know.
Yeah.
Look at
Who's the
it.
dog in the bottom one?
So that was my dog Lenny. He passed away last year. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Mum and I were just saying, he keeps a watch over you, doesn't he?
Oh, he does.
There was one thing you were talking about, the response of community, and I guess the responsibility of community. Can you tell us a bit about dementia-friendly communities and how they can kind of incorporate those domains of wellbeing?
Yeah, so again, when people think, and I've done this exercise in workshops, when I ask people and say, what's your image of somebody with dementia in your head? Draw that person. It's often a very frail, very old person in a nursing home. Now, the reality is 75% of people living with dementia live at home. Okay, not in nursing homes. So they're accessing their community every day, and they want to continue to access their community. I think thinking of dementia in a disability framework can really start to help in this community inclusion space. So in the same way that we design buildings so that if you're in a wheelchair, you can still have full access and therefore full opportunity, we need to do a similar thing around cognitive disability for people living with dementia and start to think about how do we adapt? How do we adapt the physical environment? How do we change our social response? How do we make sure people with dementia feel included and regarded and valued? And really that's what Dementia-Friendly Communities is about.
And that's the sort of great paradox in the service response that we as an industry, if you want to call it that, have embraced for many years. And it's interesting you used the word services earlier, Jason. At Chorus, we're even trying to push past that and say, look, we're talking about a fresh approach to community. We say a fresh approach to community service, and it's not services, it's service, and it's not doing things to people. It's not even really doing things for people. It's enabling them to do things themselves, which is a very deep sort of philosophy, and it goes right back to those 7 domains of wellbeing, which apply equally to you and me as somebody living with dementia, as to an older person, as to somebody living with mental illness or disability of some other description. And the underlying emphasis is to get away from treating this like a service situation with a client and a transaction and all this sort of stuff. And so what does life look like? And let's create an environment where life is good. Whatever is possible. As you say, the access is there, so the opportunity is there. And it seems to me that that's the secret for the kind of work that we do, and particularly for people living with dementia who, as you say, until relatively recently have probably been deeply mistreated and misunderstood by the system.
People's rights, if you have dementia, are no different to if you don't have dementia. In fact, they're fundamentally enshrined in the United Nations Charter of Human Rights on Disability. And of course, we feel a duty of care, and we feel that we want to keep people safe and we don't want people to be harmed. I've seen over my years a lot of disengagement and disservice done to people living with dementia, and I think that touches on Chorus's approach. This is about what can we do to be facilitators, to really provide just the infrastructure sometimes for people to live the life that they really want to live, and that's the same for people living with dementia. At the moment, it starts at diagnosis often. The person is often diagnosed, and the first message and paradigm that they get given is, this is a chronic condition with no cure. Go home and put your things in order.
Affairs in order, because it's only going to get worse.
And start thinking about what residential home you want to live in. That's the messaging that we've still got, and that you can imagine getting a diagnosis and that being the first thing you hear. There's no wonder people are devastated, and I see some people then just refuse to accept it or acknowledge it or talk about it. Other people get very depressed. Some people get very angry, as you would. So I think that prescribed disengagement, as Kate Swaffer, who's a person living with dementia, described her experience, is really the start point for this. And then if we can start at that point, then as service providers, acknowledging the shift that Chorus is making, and Alzheimer's WA as well in many ways, to actually being facilitators and community engagement focus is really the way we go forward. Having said that, of course, people need care as well sometimes, and they need help and they need assistance and they need all of those things.
But it's very often the way that is framed. I mean, absolutely, it's just so paradoxical that the best of intentions, compassion and a desire to help, can be so patronising and disempowering in the way that they play out. So it's how those services are provided, how those supports are delivered, if you like, all in the context of a philosophy that says we're here to work with you to live the life you choose.
One thing, Jason, you said before was about understanding. I know it was a number of years ago now, but I did the Alzheimer's WA experiential workshop. It was a hugely intensive setup with pretty much everyone from the organisation playing a part, and you experience, to some extent, what it might be like to walk through some tasks, and I guess a piece of time is all I can explain it, really. It's very confronting. It just gives you some understanding, gave me some understanding about what it might be like to experience dementia, and I guess that's probably would help me in not being paternalistic and thinking about how I might communicate with someone, more slowly and one step at a time and things like that. So for people working in the industry, or even for someone with someone they know with dementia, what sorts of benefits are there to these experiential programs? Nowadays there's lots more technology-based, virtual reality, and there's the virtual dementia tour. What sorts of benefits can these provide?
I think what's really interesting is we've finally woken up to the fact that dementia education needs to go beyond knowledge and skills. And to be honest, we don't do much skills training. Most dementia education is based around knowledge imparting, and that's not my experience of what particularly hands-on staff really, really require. We spend a lot of time talking about pathology and types of dementia and all of those things. What my experience has been of the very best support workers I've had the pleasure of knowing has been they're very emotionally intelligent. They have a great sense of empathy for the person that they're working with. They can shift that paternalistic view. And just to come back to that, I think when I was leading the culture change of our houses at Alzheimer's WA, what I quickly learned was these weren't bad staff. They weren't meaning to override and overpower and dictate. They were in a paradigm that had, for all of their careers, explained to them that you're doing a good job if you're doing for somebody. And that was the paradigm they'd been trained in, that was the paradigm they'd worked in. And so it took us a journey to get staff to understand that the best job that you can do is to be there for somebody when they need you and to step back when they don't. But that was a big shift in thinking, because these are very caring staff, and the way they got their emotional reward was to feel that they were caring for somebody, and they felt they were caring for somebody when they were doing for somebody. So it was a big mindset shift that we had to make. Part of that mindset shift was the emotional intelligence work, and that was really helping staff to empathise and understand. As I said, dementia is a very individual condition, so you can't know what it's like to have dementia for every person. What you can do is you can start to experience some of the things that somebody might be experiencing. And that's where these experiential learnings become really useful, because once you go through, whether it be through virtual reality or the staged experiencing dementia that we do, you start to understand the lived experience that somebody might be having. And then you start to realise that they're not doing that because of their dementia. They're more often than not doing that because of me. And that's a big shift for people. That's a very confronting shift to make. But my experience and my belief is that most of the distress and suffering we see in people living with dementia isn't because of the pathology of the disease. It's because of the people and community and societal response to the world that that person's now living in.
So we've talked a couple of times on previous podcasts and then again today about Andy, who's been a volunteer with Chorus for, I think, nearly 10 years. And he's been living with young onset dementia. He's only still in his late 50s. And for me, it's almost a story of the best way we can respond and to live what you've just described, Jason, where rather than trying to do things for Andy and push back towards him the service models that we have internalised. We, and I can take absolutely no credit for this because it happened before I was part of Chorus, offered him an opportunity to become a volunteer within our gardening teams. And it's, as you said, Jason, it's been transformational for him in his dementia journey. His wife Jackie has just literally this week emailed us and told us that Andy's had to move into a nursing home, and that's a really challenging thing, and it's a sad moment. And she's written an email. I just want to share some of it with you. She says, "Today was the first time since his admission that I've seen him, and it was harrowing. He was so distraught that he was not coming home. As they are young men in an old person's home, it really is unacceptable, but there is no other option. Tonight, Andy said he never thought his life would come to this at 58. Even though many cognitive abilities are gone, his insight into his condition is at a very high level. He knows and understands what is going on, and that makes it all so much more challenging and heart-wrenching. I just wanted to thank you and all the team at Chorus for the wonderful embracement, care, kindness and respect you all gave to Andy on this horrific young onset dementia journey. You all gave him so much courage to help face this disease and helped him continue on with assistance to maintain a normal working day and work ethic within the organisation. And for that, I'll be eternally grateful. It really has meant the world to us, and we will forever be grateful for all you guys have done for Andy on his dementia journey." I just think that's it's a one example of where maybe the community's kind of got it right. I think
it's a great example. As I said, I think the opportunity to become involved with Chorus for Andy, not as a client, but as something very different, just made such a difference to his whole lived experience, because fundamentally that was about identity and it was about meaning and purpose for him. And it was done in an environment of security. And by security, I don't mean safety as we normally think about safety with people with dementia, locked doors and big walls, but safety as in I'm around people who I can trust and who trust me and who I value and who value me. And I think if our service provision in community can move to that, then that's an amazing movement that we'll have. The experience in residential care, sadly, is so far removed from that. It's still very institutional. It's massively under-resourced. The physical environments are large-scale, impersonal, task-orientated. We've just got so far to go in residential care. Particularly, younger onset dementia is different for many people. We just don't have any younger onset dementia long-term care options at the moment other than old age residential care homes.
We've had a fantastic conversation today, Jason. Thank you very much for coming in and sharing all that you know. And I think for me, we've heard some personal stories. We've heard of what's going on as far as we understand it. And we've heard of both the lows and the highs of how we as a society are responding to this challenge.
So going to see a GP is a really important thing to do. What else or where else can people go if they've got queries or concerns about dementia for themselves or anyone else?
Yeah, obviously Alzheimer's WA is been here in Western Australia for 35 years now, supporting people living with dementia and the carers, and we offer a whole range of services both directly to support the carer in their journey and also the person living with dementia in their journey. So I would encourage, if you have just got a diagnosis of dementia, or if you want to talk to somebody about anything to do with dementia, then get in touch with us. We've got an amazing website that's just chock-a-block full of resources for people, and carers find that really useful. Or you can give us a call, and we're more than happy to have a chat and see if we can answer questions. So Alzheimer's WA is there. Our motto is by your side on your dementia journey, and that's what we aim to do. So please do contact us.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jason. Well, it's been a really wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you coming into the studio. Thanks so much, Jason.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Lou.
Thanks for listening to Chorus Voices, the podcast brought to you by Chorus. If you like our show and wanted to know more, check out our website at chorus.org.au. And please leave a review. We'd love to hear your feedback, and it helps others find us and enjoy the podcast as well. Join us next time for more inspiring stories and news from our community. Chorus, a fresh approach to community service.